Sophia's fingers trembled as she clutched the steel grips of the commercial waste container, though not from the burden of refuse or even from the strain of 6 months' pregnancy that transformed stooping into an act of measured struggle. Her trembling came from 200 watching eyes fixed on her spouse, Marcus, as he issued this degradation at Titan Industries' yearly conference, while his paramour, Rebecca, captured the moment on her device with thinly veiled satisfaction. And because the decision confronting her became suddenly, devastatingly transparent. For 3 years she'd maintained her persona as S. Winters, the billionaire chairperson who'd launched Titan from her university residence into a worldwide juggernaut, distinct from her role as Mrs. Bennett, the reserved spouse who graced corporate gatherings but never truly belonged in Marcus's calculating social network. The division had been deliberate, an examination of sorts, to determine if he'd wed her for affection or advantage. Now she possessed her resolution, and it manifested in the form of garbage. The directors, who actually recognized who she was, remained motionless, unsure whether to step in or await her indication, while the rest murmured about Marcus's boldness and Rebecca's shamelessness. In 7 minutes, Marcus's elevation to executive vice president was set to be proclaimed, the rank he'd campaigned for ceaselessly, the accomplishment he'd already commemorated with Rebecca in manners that had reached Sophia's awareness through deliberately sustained corporate intelligence systems. But Sophia was already drafting the message that would nullify everything. Have you ever been undervalued by someone who should have cherished you most? This narrative exposes the ruinous price of dismissing your partner and the strength of recognizing your value. You'll discover how to identify harmful relationship dynamics, comprehend when silence transforms into enablement, and uncover why self-respect matters beyond vengeance. What insights connected with you? What would you have done distinctly if you were Sophia? Share your reflections in the comments below. I examine every single one. If you appreciated this narrative and desire more impactful, compelling tales with authentic life wisdom, press that subscribe button. Your encouragement signifies everything. The morning had commenced with possibility, or at minimum the facade of it. Sophia had selected her charcoal maternity garment deliberately, the one with delicate platinum threading that captured illumination without commanding notice, the one that rendered her looking refined enough for Titan's yearly conference, but expectant enough that individuals might recall she was 6 months pregnant and extend her a chair. She'd reached the 43rd floor executive chamber 30 minutes beforehand, partially because timeliness had been instilled in her during her years constructing Titan from a collegiate venture into a $15 billion enterprise, but primarily because she desired to study Marcus in his native environment without his awareness she was observing. He hadn't detected her enter through the auxiliary entrance. Hadn't noticed her assume a position in the rear row designated for executive partners and distinguished visitors. But she'd witnessed him. She'd observed him chuckle too vigorously at Regional Supervisor Thompson's witticism, observed him contact Rebecca's shoulder just a measure longer than professional decorum necessitated. Observed him inspect his device and grin at whatever communication awaited there. The Marcus she'd married 3 years prior had been driven but compassionate, motivated but thoughtful, ambitious for achievement, but not at the sacrifice of his principles. The individual she observed now navigated through the space like a predator, all deliberate attraction and scarcely contained hostility, his gaze perpetually evaluating who mattered and who didn't. Rebecca occupied the 3rd row, her standing as marketing supervisor, granting her entry to conferences she had no justification attending based on her genuine job execution. But Sophia had long since ceased questioning how Rebecca kept progressing despite reliably average quarterly assessments. The explanation resided in the text communications Sophia's confidential investigator had transmitted last month, the lodging invoices from the Los Angeles convention, the bouquets charged to Marcus's corporate account that had never materialized at their residence. Sophia had constructed an empire by accumulating intelligence before executing decisions, and she'd accumulated plenty about her spouse's supplementary pursuits, but intelligence and execution were distinct currencies, and she'd been anticipating the proper instant to expend what she possessed. The conference advanced with mechanical proficiency. Quarterly returns surpassed forecasts by 18%. The extension into European territories displayed encouraging preliminary figures. The innovative software incorporation had diminished operational expenses by $12 million yearly. Sophia absorbed executives presenting initiatives she'd sanctioned in her identity as S. Winters, the enigmatic board chairperson who communicated chiefly through encoded emails and video conferences with her camera deactivated. The woman whose strategic perspective had revolutionized Titan, but whose appearance remained unfamiliar to most of the corporation. She'd instituted this division deliberately when she'd encountered Marcus at a philanthropy gathering 4 years ago, had presented herself utilizing only her middle designation, Sophia, and had preserved her position at Titan completely distinct from her personal existence. It had been an assessment she'd convinced herself, a method to ascertain if someone could cherish her for herself rather than for her prosperity or power. Marcus had appeared flawless, ambitious enough to appreciate determination, but not so frantic that he'd sacrifice his ethics for progression. He'd proposed after 8 months, had endorsed her resolution to operate in consulting rather than press for particulars about her profession, had appeared genuinely enthusiastic about constructing a life together rather than constructing a network. But individuals reveal themselves gradually in minor compromises and incremental treacheries, in the distance between who they promise to be and who they genuinely become when examined. Sophia had observed Marcus's metamorphosis with the analytical detachment she typically reserved for market evaluation, cataloging each instance he selected progression over integrity. Each occasion he returned residence later with flimsier rationalizations. Each evolution of his grin from authentic to deliberate. She delayed because she desired to be mistaken. Because separation while expecting seemed like defeat because some portion of her still remembered the individual who'd clasped her hand during her father's burial and promised to construct something genuine together. The waste container altered everything but not because of what it symbolized. Sophia had tolerated dismissive remarks before, had learned to traverse a world that frequently underestimated quiet women with unassuming demeanors. The waste container mattered because of the spectators. Because Marcus selected this instant in front of 200 executives at Titan's yearly conference to demonstrate precisely how minimal he valued her, to exhibit his disdain for Rebecca's amusement, to establish absolutely certain Sophia comprehended her position in his hierarchy of significance. Sophia, his voice sliced through the post-presentation chatter, projected loud enough to guarantee attention. The refuse is overflowing. Address it. Not an inquiry not softened with could you or when you have a moment. An instruction delivered with the casual brutality of someone who'd neglected that matrimony was supposed to be collaboration rather than possession. 200 countenances pivoted toward her. Some astonished, some uneasy, some deliberately impartial in that manner corporate politics mandated. Rebecca's device was already documenting, her grin sharp with triumph. Sophia stood gradually, her hand stabilizing herself against the chair support, her other hand instinctively shielding the expansion of her midsection. The board members who recognized her authentic identity, CFO Richardson, Legal Supervisor Martinez, Strategy VP Okonkwo, sat immobilized, their expressions cycling between dismay and bewilderment, uncertain whether this was some examination they'd failed to comprehend or a legitimate crisis demanding intervention. She advanced toward the waste container with deliberate paces, each one a countdown to a determination she'd been evading for months, and elevated the steel grips with quaking hands. The chamber was hushed as she advanced to the waste container, each step feeling like a distance. The burden of the instant pressed down on her chest, suffocating her in front of an audience that had never witnessed her this exposed. She'd been a presence at Titan, someone who commanded esteem without requesting it, a woman who had constructed an empire in quietness. And now she was being diminished to this mortification in front of individuals who had no conception what she was truly capable of. As she reached the container, she hesitated. It would have been effortless, so effortless to just acquiesce, to take the refuse, to return to her position, to maintain the performance for the sake of avoiding confrontation. But she recognized that if she did, she would forfeit more than just this instant. She would forfeit herself. Her fingers tightened around the steel grips of the waste container, and she could sense the eyes of everyone on her, anticipating her to react. Some of them were probably expecting her to collapse, to weep, to disintegrate under the burden of her spouse's callousness. But that wasn't who Sophia was. She pivoted, her movements calculated, and advanced back toward the front of the chamber. The countenances around her shifted from astonishment to bewilderment to something else, something they wouldn't have anticipated from a woman who had always been a quiet spectator. Sophia, Marcus summoned again, his voice sharper now, a hint of exasperation creeping in. I stated, address it. But she didn't halt. She didn't even glance in his direction. She simply advanced to the front of the chamber, her gaze never wavering. As she reached the platform, her pulse accelerating, she sensed the instant stretch out like an eternity. The determination she had executed was conclusive. The waste container had been her breaking point. But it wasn't just about the refuse. It was about everything. The years of observing her spouse's gradual metamorphosis, the countless compromises, the realization that he had never truly perceived her, never truly comprehended who she was. Sophia positioned the waste container on the floor with a soft impact, her fingers still quivering. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice composed and steady as she addressed the chamber. "Ladies and gentlemen," she commenced, her eyes sweeping over the board members who were still immobilized in position. "I think we've all acquired a very significant lesson today. A lesson about esteem and about authority." The chamber was hushed again. Everyone anticipating her next words, uncertain of where this would proceed. But Sophia recognized this was her instant. The steel grips felt frigid against Sophia's palms, but the frigidity spreading through her chest had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with transparency. She'd spent 3 years fabricating elaborate justifications for Marcus's conduct, the pressure of corporate progression, the strain of impending fatherhood, the natural progression of romantic intensity into comfortable collaboration. But those justifications disintegrated as she stood before 200 executives clutching garbage like a servant dismissed with a gesture. The chamber had descended into the particular quietness that follows social transgressions, that suspended instant when everyone anticipates to see whether the victim will accept mortification or challenge it. Sophia could sense the burden of expectations pressing against her from multiple directions. The executives who didn't recognize her identity expected her to acquiesce or quietly depart to preserve the social arrangement Marcus had instituted. The board members who did recognize observed with barely concealed alarm, uncertain whether her next maneuver would be personal retaliation or strategic corporate maneuvering, both of which could detonate spectacularly in this public forum. But Rebecca's device camera compelled the determination because mortification documented became mortification permanent, and Sophia had constructed Titan by comprehending that perception shaped reality more powerfully than facts ever could. If this recording circulated, and Rebecca's malicious grin suggested it absolutely would, Sophia's deliberately maintained division between her public and private identities would dissolve not through her own revelation, but through someone else's ridicule, which was insufferable on every level that mattered. She positioned the waste container down deliberately, the metallic sound reverberating in the quietness with surprising conclusiveness, and reached into her jacket pocket for her device. Her fingers located the apparatus with practiced facility despite their quivering, and she accessed the encrypted messaging application she utilized for emergency board communications, the one connected directly to CEO Morrison's executive dashboard, to CFO Richardson's crisis management system, to the corporate governance protocols she'd instituted specifically for situations demanding immediate authority. The message took 7 seconds to draft. Cancel Bennett elevation. Terminate employment effective immediately. Full explanation to follow. SW. She pressed send before doubt could interfere. Before the accumulated burden of 3 years of matrimony could convince her to select private confrontation over public consequence. Before the portion of her that still remembered loving Marcus could suggest mercy he'd never shown her. The message delivered with a soft vibration, and she observed CFO Richardson's countenance across the chamber, register astonishment as his own device buzzed with the alert, observed him glance at the message and then at her, observed comprehension dawn with the force of revelation. Actually, Sophia stated, her voice slicing through the quietness with surprising steadiness despite the chaos churning in her chest. I think we need to address something before this conference continues. Marcus's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to irritation, his grin tightening at the edges in that manner that meant he was about to state something cutting, something designed to place her back in her position. But she'd already activated the electronic platform at the front of the chamber, already accessed the presentation system with her executive override codes, already retrieved the identity verification screen that would transform this mortification into something far more devastating for everyone who'd undervalued her. For those who don't recognize, she continued, her hand quivering slightly as she pressed the button that would display her credentials on the massive screen behind her. My full legal designation is Sophia Elizabeth Winters Bennett. I use my middle designation socially, but professionally I operate as S. Winters. The screen illuminated with her official Titan Industries board chairperson identification, complete with the photograph she'd had captured 7 years ago when she'd incorporated the corporation in her Harvard residence hall with nothing but a laptop and an algorithm that would revolutionize data analytics. The photo displayed her younger countenance, but the same quiet intensity, the same deliberate composure that masked ambition individuals consistently undervalued because she wore it without arrogance. The quietness transformed from uneasy to electric, charged with the particular energy that precedes corporate catastrophe. She observed realization spread through the chamber in waves. First the board members who'd recognized confirming what others suspected. Then the senior executives recognizing the signature they'd witnessed on countless memos. Then the mid-level managers comprehending why CFO Richardson had gone pale. And finally Marcus himself, his countenance cycling through bewilderment, disbelief, and then the kind of dawning dismay that comes from recognizing you've executed an irreversible mistake. I founded Titan Industries 8 years ago, Sophia continued, her voice gaining strength from the truth she'd kept hidden too long. I've served as board chairperson since incorporation. I've sanctioned every major strategic determination, every executive appointment, and yes, Marcus, I sanctioned your elevation to executive vice president, which was scheduled to be proclaimed in approximately 4 minutes. She hesitated, letting the past tense of was scheduled settle into the chamber's collective consciousness, observing Marcus's countenance drain of color as he processed the implications cascading toward him like dominoes toppling in slow motion. However, circumstances have changed, she stated, her hand moving to her midsection in a gesture that was both protective and accusatory, a reminder that she stood here 6 months pregnant after he demanded she empty refuse in front of his paramour. CFO Richardson, I believe you have an announcement to execute regarding personnel changes. Richardson stood gradually, his expression deliberately impartial in that manner senior executives perfected when delivering news they'd never imagined having to deliver. He cleared his throat twice, shuffled papers he didn't need, and finally met Marcus's eyes with something approximating pity. Marcus Bennett's elevation to executive vice president has been cancelled effective immediately. Furthermore, his employment with Titan Industries is terminated, also effective immediately. Security will escort him from the building following this conference. Rebecca's device clattered to the floor, the recording abruptly ending as her hands went slack with astonishment. The executives who'd chuckled at Thompson's witticism earlier now studied their shoes with sudden fascination, desperate to avoid association with the individual who just committed career suicide by humiliating the woman who literally owned the corporation. Even Thompson himself had moved several feet away from Marcus, creating visible distance from the contamination of catastrophic judgment. But Sophia wasn't finished because mortification demanded reflection and consequence demanded completeness, and she'd learned from constructing Titan that half measures produced half results, which meant nothing changed and everything festered. She retrieved a second screen, this one displaying Rebecca's performance assessments from the past 18 months. Each one average. Each one somehow resulting in elevation or bonus. Each one signed off by Marcus utilizing authority he'd apparently assumed included the right to trade corporation resources for personal gratification. Rebecca Carter, Sophia stated, her voice still steady despite the satisfaction burning in her chest like vindication finally allowed to breathe. Your standing as marketing supervisor is also terminated effective immediately. Your performance assessments suggest this determination should have been executed months ago, but better late than never. The chamber had transcended quietness into something approaching vacuum. Everyone holding their breath as if exhaling might draw notice, might make them the next target of the reckoning unfolding with methodical precision. Sophia had constructed Titan by comprehending leverage, by recognizing that authority deployed strategically accomplished more than authority deployed emotionally, and she wielded both her power and her self-respect like weapons forged from 3 years of quiet observation and deliberate documentation. Marcus finally located his voice, though it emerged fractured. Sophia, I never recognized. We can discuss this privately. We can. We could have discussed many things privately, Sophia interrupted, her hand still resting on her midsection, still shielding the child who would mature recognizing their mother had selected self-respect over accommodation, consequence over rationalizations. We could have discussed your affair with Rebecca. We could have discussed the lodging invoices, the text communications, the bouquets you purchased her with our finances. We could have discussed whether you married me for affection or advantage, but you selected this instant, this audience, this mortification, so I'm selecting this response. She gathered her belongings with calculated care, her movements slow but purposeful, each gesture communicating that she was departing by selection rather than fleeing in distress, that she controlled this situation despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. The baby kicked against her ribs, either protesting the strain or offering solidarity, and she took it as the latter because she needed to believe something beneficial would come from this wreckage. The board will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she stated, addressing the executives still immobilized in their positions. CFO Richardson will serve as acting CEO until we complete our search for someone who comprehends that leadership demands integrity, not just ambition. This conference is adjourned. Sophia made it to her confidential office on the 45th floor before the quivering in her legs compelled her to sit down, before the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation evaporated and left behind the raw ache of a matrimony ending in the most public manner imaginable. The office had been her sanctuary for 8 years, decorated in minimalist whites and soft grays that promoted the kind of clear-thinking corporate leadership demanded. But now the familiar space felt contaminated by everything she'd just destroyed downstairs. She'd destroyed her matrimony, yes, but the matrimony had been dying gradually for months, perhaps longer if she was honest with herself. What she'd actually destroyed was the illusion that Marcus had married her rather than the opportunity she represented. The fantasy that affection could survive disdain. The desperate hope that the individual who'd promised collaboration had simply lost his direction rather than revealed his true character. Destroying illusions hurt worse than destroying reality, because illusions required your own participation, your own willingness to ignore evidence in favor of the narrative you desired to believe. Her device vibrated with incoming communications, dozens of them, the corporate communication system lighting up with executives scrambling to process what they'd witnessed and position themselves appropriately in its aftermath. CFO Richardson had transmitted 3 communications in rapid succession. The first asking if she needed anything. The second requesting an emergency board conference to discuss succession planning. The third simply stating, "I'm sorry you had to do that publicly, but for what it's worth, you handled it with more grace than he deserved." She appreciated Richardson's sentiment, but grace felt like the wrong term for what she'd done. Grace implied forgiveness or mercy, and she'd offered neither, had instead selected surgical precision in dismantling everything Marcus had constructed on the foundation of her hidden identity. Precision wasn't grace, but it was clean, and clean cuts healed faster than ragged ones. Or at minimum that's what she convinced herself as she stared at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that had cost more than most individuals' residences. The flashback hit without warning, pulling her back 14 months to the night Marcus had come residence smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, and explained it away with a narrative about Rebecca spilling wine at a client dinner, about helping her clean up, about how Sophia shouldn't worry because Rebecca was not his type anyway. She'd believed him then, or convinced herself she did, because the alternative meant confronting truths she wasn't ready to face. She'd been 4 months pregnant, still adjusting to the reality of impending motherhood, still clinging to the vision of family they'd planned together over Chinese takeout and shared dreams. But that night had marked a shift, a hairline fracture in the foundation that would widen incrementally until today's earthquake shattered everything constructed upon it. She'd started paying attention distinctly after that, not with the trust of a spouse, but with the analytical scrutiny she applied to potential business partners, cataloging inconsistencies and cross-referencing narratives against evidence her confidential investigator provided monthly. The investigator had been her father's suggestion during one of their last conversations before the cancer took him, back when he'd witnessed something in Marcus that worried him, but couldn't articulate beyond, "Just be cautious, sweetheart." Ambitious individuals sometimes confuse spouses with assets. Her father had constructed his own fortune through deliberate observation and pattern recognition, and he taught Sophia that individuals revealed themselves through accumulated small selections rather than dramatic instances. Marcus's small selections had accumulated into an undeniable pattern. The late nights that increased after her pregnancy started displaying. The business trips that extended by just one more day. The manner his eyes slid past her at corporation gatherings while lingering on Rebecca's deliberately calculated grins. The gradual erosion of intimacy until they were roommates who occasionally discussed logistics rather than partners who shared existences. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sophia pressed her hand against the movement with a mixture of affection and fear. She desired this child desperately, had imagined raising them with a partner who valued family over ambition, who comprehended that legacy meant more than quarterly returns and corner offices. Now she'd be raising them alone, or at minimum without Marcus, and the single motherhood she'd never planned suddenly stretched before her like uncharted territory, demanding navigation without maps. But she'd constructed Titan without maps, had transformed a residence hall algorithm into a global empire through strategic thinking and calculated risk-taking. And if she could do that, she could certainly raise a child without an individual who'd proven himself incapable of basic esteem, let alone collaboration. The thought brought surprising comfort, a sense that perhaps this ending was also a beginning, that removing Marcus from her existence created space for something superior, even if she couldn't yet imagine what that superior thing might be. A knock on her door interrupted the spiral of thoughts threatening to pull her under. She straightened in her chair, wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling, and called out with a voice that sounded steadier than she felt. "Come in." CFO Richardson entered cautiously, his expression deliberate and concerned, carrying a leather portfolio she recognized as containing emergency board resolutions demanding her signature. He'd been with Titan since the early days, had observed her construct the corporation from scrappy venture to industry leader, had been one of the few individuals who recognized her dual identity from the beginning, and had never questioned her reasons for maintaining it. "I brought the termination paperwork," he stated quietly, settling into the chair across from her desk with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd occupied it during countless strategy sessions. "Legal needs your signature to establish it official, and HR is asking about severance packages, though personally, I think Marcus forfeited any claim to generosity when he handed you that waste container." 3 hours after the conference that had demolished her matrimony, Sophia sat in the executive parking garage, observing Marcus load boxes into his automobile with the jerky, aggressive movements of someone whose anger had nowhere productive to proceed. Security had escorted him from the building as promised, but she'd instructed them to grant him 30 minutes to collect personal items from his office. Not out of generosity, but because she desired to witness this final instant, desired to see the physical manifestation of consequences he'd earned through accumulated disdain and calculated treachery. He hadn't witnessed her yet. Her black sedan parked 3 rows away with tinted windows that transformed her into an invisible spectator, a reversal of the authority dynamic that had defined their matrimony. For 3 years she'd been the one observed and judged, evaluated against standards she'd never agreed to, found wanting by an individual who'd married an illusion and resented the reality. Now she observed him struggle with a box of personal effects that probably included the photo of them from their wedding day back when his grin had seemed authentic and her hope had felt justified. The baby kicked and she wondered what she'd communicate to this child about their father someday, how she'd explain that affection wasn't always enough when esteem was absent, that collaboration required mutual value rather than hierarchical arrangement, that some individuals revealed themselves gradually and then all at once in instances that crystallized everything you'd been attempting not to see. She'd communicate the truth, she determined, age-appropriate versions that evolved as they matured because children deserved honesty even when it hurt. Rebecca emerged from the building 20 minutes after Marcus, her own box noticeably smaller, her heels clicking against concrete with sharp staccato rhythm that suggested fury barely contained. She approached Marcus's automobile with the presumption of shared grievance, as if their terminations created alliance rather than mutual culpability, as if Sophia's revelation had victimized them equally rather than exposed them completely. Sophia couldn't hear their conversation through the closed windows, but she didn't need to. Body language communicated the narrative clearly enough. Rebecca's animated gesturing suggesting blame directed outward. Marcus's defensive posture indicating he'd already started rewriting history to cast himself as victim rather than architect of his own destruction. Both of them engaged in the kind of revisionism that individuals performed when facing consequences they'd never imagined would actually arrive. The flashback came unbidden, pulling her back 6 years to the Harvard Business School entrepreneurship competition, where she'd first pitched Titan's core algorithm back when the corporation was just a concept that judges had called interesting but impractical, despite her data proving otherwise. She'd won anyway, had taken their skepticism and transformed it into fuel for the obsessive work ethic that constructed Titan into something that made those same judges request conferences they'd never receive. Constructing the corporation had taught her that other individuals' perceptions mattered less than her own execution, that proving herself demanded only her own effort and vision, that achievement was the ultimate response to doubt. But matrimony had demanded distinct skills than entrepreneurship, had demanded vulnerability she'd struggled to extend while maintaining the protective distance that kept her identity hidden, had created impossible paradoxes where honesty meant exposure and exposure meant losing the examination she'd fabricated to measure Marcus's affection. Perhaps she'd engineered her own heartbreak by creating conditions no relationship could survive, by examining him against standards she'd never communicated, by expecting him to cherish someone he'd never fully recognized. The thought brought unexpected guilt, uncomfortable questions about her own culpability in the matrimony's failure, whether her deception had created the very disdain she'd punished him for displaying. But then she remembered the waste container, the 200 witnesses, the calculated brutality of selecting that instant for that mortification, and the guilt evaporated because whatever her mistakes, they didn't justify public degradation, didn't excuse his affair with Rebecca, didn't somehow transform his selections into her responsibility. Marcus slammed his trunk with unnecessary force, the sound reverberating through the parking garage like punctuation on a sentence neither of them had desired to complete. He glanced toward the building one final time, his expression cycling through emotions too complex to categorize before climbing into his automobile and starting the engine. Rebecca stood alone beside her own vehicle, observing him depart without her, apparently realizing that shared termination didn't automatically create shared future, that Marcus's loyalty extended only as far as convenience allowed. Sophia started her own automobile as Marcus's tail lights disappeared toward the exit, not following him, but preparing to depart herself, to drive to the penthouse apartment that would feel emptier now despite being unchanged physically, to commence the process of untangling a shared existence into separate existences connected only by the child growing inside her and the legal proceedings that would formalize their dissolution. But before departing, she retrieved her device and drafted one final communication, not to Marcus but to her executive assistant. Schedule board conference for tomorrow, 9:00 a.m. Agenda items. Permanent CEO search, maternity leave coverage, succession planning. Also, schedule appointment with family law attorney for next week. And please arrange for movers to pack Marcus's belongings from the penthouse, have everything transmitted to storage, bill it to his severance package. The communication transmitted with a soft whoosh, each agenda item a step toward the future she'd have to construct alone, or at minimum without the partner she'd imagined constructing it beside. The family law attorney would handle the separation with the same proficiency Titan's legal team applied to corporate acquisitions, transforming the end of her matrimony into paperwork and asset division and custody arrangements that reduced affection's failure into contractual terms. She drove residents through evening traffic, the city lights blurring slightly through tears she finally allowed herself to shed in private away from the corporate mask she'd maintained through the day's emotional demolition. The penthouse waited 43 floors above the street, all floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture she'd selected before Marcus had moved in, before she'd compromised her aesthetic to accommodate his preference for darker woods and heavier fabrics, before she'd started executing small concessions that accumulated into larger losses of self. Tomorrow she'd reclaim that space, would donate his furniture to philanthropy and restore the clean lines and open light she'd originally designed, would transform the apartment back into hers alone rather than theirs together. Tomorrow she'd meet with the board and commence the CEO's search that would let her step back from daily operations as her pregnancy advanced, would plan for maternity leave and the work-existence balance she'd neglected constructing Titan at the sacrifice of everything else. But tonight she sat in her automobile in the underground garage of her building, hands resting on her midsection, feeling the baby move, and grieved not for Marcus specifically, but for the version of him she'd imagined existed, for the matrimony she'd desired rather than the one she'd actually had, for the family structure she'd planned that would now take distinct shape than anticipated. Grief felt appropriate even when consequences were just, because loss was loss regardless of whether it was necessary, and she'd lost the future she'd envisioned, even if that future had been constructed on foundations too fragile to support the burden of reality. Her device buzzed with responses to her communication, her assistant confirming all arrangements, Richardson transmitting encouragement for the evening ahead, her attorney accepting the appointment and promising to establish the separation as painless as legally possible. The corporate machinery she'd constructed continued functioning despite her personal crisis, because beneficial systems survived individual catastrophes, because she'd designed Titan to operate whether she was present or not, because delegation and structure created resilience that individual effort alone could never achieve. She rode the elevator to the penthouse, each floor a countdown to the solitude waiting above, and keyed into the apartment that still smelled faintly of Marcus's cologne, still held evidence of their shared existence in photos she'd need to remove, in furniture she'd need to replace, in memories she'd need to reconcile with the individual he'd revealed himself to be today. The view from her living room window displayed the city spreading endlessly toward horizons lit by millions of existences intersecting and diverging, connecting and separating, loving and losing in patterns as old as human existence. She'd survived this, she recognized, because she'd survived worse in constructing Titan from nothing, because resilience was her inheritance from a father who'd taught her that setbacks were intelligence rather than failure, because the baby moving inside her demanded she construct an existence worth inheriting regardless of how much it hurt right now. She'd survive because she had no selection except surviving, because the alternative was unthinkable, because women had been picking up pieces and constructing new structures from rubble since the beginning of time. The thought brought unexpected strength, a sense of connection to every woman who'd ever faced treachery and selected self-respect over bitterness, consequence over vengeance, survival over surrender. She wasn't unique in her pain, but she had unique resources for addressing it. Financial security that meant she'd never be trapped by economics, professional achievement that meant her identity extended beyond spouse and soon-to-be mother, a support system she'd constructed through years of deliberate relationship cultivation that would help her navigate the transition ahead. Sophia stood at her window, observing the city lights blur and sharpen as tears came and went, her hand pressed against the glass that separated her from the 43-floor drop below, and made herself a promise. She would not let Marcus's treachery define her narrative, would not let this chapter become the entire narrative, would not sacrifice who she was becoming to who she'd been compelled to be today. She'd executed hard selections in that chamber, had wielded authority with precision rather than rage, had selected consequence over accommodation, and while the aftermath hurt more than she'd anticipated, she wouldn't apologize for valuing herself enough to demand superior. The baby kicked again, insistent and strong, and she took it as agreement, as the next generation reminding her that the future mattered more than the past, that what she constructed from these ruins would matter more than the structure that had collapsed. Tomorrow would bring board conferences and attorney consultations and the beginning of untangling 3 years of shared existence. But tonight she stood in her reclaimed space and grieved what was lost while simultaneously celebrating what remained. Her corporation, her strength, her child, her future unwritten and waiting to be shaped by selections she'd make with eyes finally, devastatingly, completely open.